Dr. Nishi Singh is a microbiologist and virologist of great repute. An outstanding scholar from her undergraduate days, she was the best outgoing student from Lady Hardinge Medical College, Delhi. She did her MD in microbiology from All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Delhi, and then went to the UK, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, to qualify in microbiology and virology, obtaining her membership and the fellowship from the Royal College of Pathologists in Virology. She headed the Department of Microbiology, Pathology and Infection Control at Dubai Hospital and Rashid Hospital for 10 years. She taught at the various colleges of the United Arab Emirates and was one of the favorite teachers. Her work in the field of medical education, prevention, and control of infectious diseases has received many accolades in the UAE community. As you hear her, you will understand why she was one of the favorite teachers.
Hi, everybody. What a delight this morning to be talking to so many women across the world. And I'm thankful to Meenakshi to have introduced this particular technique to my daughters as well. I think we are all way past the age where we can use it, but certainly we can work towards helping the younger women, as Meenakshi says, greening the red. So I think that's a very appropriate talk to title that you girls have given, committed women. I think the committed band of women that's around the world to work towards this. So I'm going to keep it very informal because really I don't want you all to become a microbiologist at the end of this talk. But however, there are just so many misconceptions about vagina and bacteria and germs and the phobia that goes around in the name of germs. And I think women, especially because they also become caretakers for their elderly, for their children, as mothers, as wives, they, I think, get neurotic. The sad thing is that the advertising industry has also perpetuated so many myths about germs, so to say, that we have now reached a point where we just want to sterilize the world and everything is dirty and everything is yucky and whatever. So I think what I would, Meenakshi and I think you girls had collected a lot of questions. So I think what I'm going to do is structure my talk around really answering the questions rather than taking a formal lecture. So I think my opening sentence would be that we first have to understand what vaginal microbiome means. And I'm sure many of you who've read literature recently have seen that this term has become very, very important in the way we function uh, for the human body. Now, you know, when I started training as a physician and then as an infectious disease physician, we were taught very different things. And I myself have learned in the last 20 years or so, out of the 40-year career in infectious diseases, that what we were taught initially was so wrong. And I think this came into being as a result of the techniques that have been made available to us from in terms of molecular biology, in terms of recognizing the germs, so to say. So one of the things that really made a difference for us was the Human Genome Project. Some of you may have heard, and please just stop me if I'm getting going too overboard and with the microbiological details. But I think it's a good idea to have a basic understanding of where we are going, and that will help us to answer a lot of questions that I saw on your list. Now, remember when the Human Genome Project was started about 20 years ago, uh, the complex human organism that we are, and I keep my bugs and me in the same spectrum because we really are very similar. So, you know, to run a complex human organism like us, we needed the geneticists and the microbiologists thought we needed something like 100,000 genes to make us function at the level that we do. And lo and behold, after sequencing all the genes, we realized that we are only about 20,000 or 25,000 genes. So then the whole concept came that where is all this extra information to run our human body normally? Where is it coming from? normally is coming from. And therefore, the whole concept of human microbiome came into being, because we cannot exist without the entire flora of bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi that live on us and within us. Now, there are areas of the body which are completely sterile, but there are other areas of the body that are teeming. In fact, teeming is a very, I would say, an understatement, because if you count the number of human cells in the body, we are about a trillion human cells, which are me. But mine, which are my organisms, outnumber my cells by a ratio of 1 is to 1,000. So I have essentially 1,000 trillion other living beings that live on me to make me function normally. So, therefore, this quest of sterilizing and cleaning and trying to remove these mine from me, I think has ruined the human race, so to say. And like I said before, I think the advertising agency and the pharmaceutical industry has a lot of role in selling. And I would not like to take any commercial names, but we all know the kind of products we use in a common household and the constant advertising that we are bombarded with. So coming down to the vagina, and of course, we all know that the maximum number of organisms that we have in our body are in our gastrointestinal tract. So our stool, for instance, if you take 1 gram of stool, we have 10 to the 12 organisms per gram of stool. But they are normal as long as they stay in the lower gastrointestinal tract. Same way, coming to the genital tract, and Dr. Meenakshi has very kindly provided me the model. Our vagina has much less, 1,000-fold less organisms than the gut that stays behind, but we still have a vagina teeming with organisms normally. Now, what are these normal organisms? I can actually recite the entire textbook of microbiology when I start taking names. So from staph to streptococci to diphtheroids to corynebacteria to a significant number of every bacteria family that we know lives in our vagina. And that is normal microbiome that nature has put for protection of my upper genital tract. And you can see the mouth of the cervix here, it is closed. And these bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi that live in the vagina do not normally ascend up. Now, one of the questions was that how is it that the vagina keeps itself clean and what is it made up of? Now, the vagina, we are so used to seeing these diagrams that we think of the vagina as like a cylindrical canal sitting straight in my body. But in a real human female, it is not like this. The whole thing is curled up into a little ball, and it's all sitting literally inside my pelvic space, and it's not even erect. It's actually lying almost semi-vertical, semi-horizontal. So the vagina is essentially, in a living female, a H-shaped structure where it is now living, if I'm putting it sideways, living like this and slightly curved, and the uterus moves forward and the ovaries go behind. Okay, so this is, and you can see these lines, which we call the rugae. The lining of the vagina is stratified squamous epithelium, which is almost quite like the skin that we have. So it is a nice thick lining that nature has provided us. And then behind that, the other layers are lymphoreticular tissues, because we need our lymphocytes to come and make sure that nothing crosses into the tissues behind and forward, which are sterile. And there's rugae, curl up and open up as the vagina expands to expel the fetus, because after all, human genital tract's function is to procreate. So, now, okay, so coming to the bacteria inside. So the bacteria live inside the cavity, do not cross the walls, and they then provide us with 1,000 billion organisms that are sitting here to make sure that none of the pathogens, now the pathogens are the one that cause disease. Now we must realize that we're talking about the microbiome here. As we have studied organisms in and around us, it is very, very clear that almost 95% of the organisms that live in and around us are normal. They are not disease causing, they are non pathogenic. Only 5% of all the bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi that we know are pathogenic in people who are immunocompromised or have cancer or transplants or other kinds of diseases, whatever. In a normal healthy person, only less than 1%, maximum of 1% of everything that we know can cause disease. So really, what are we trying to achieve by killing all the 99% to just prevent disease from 1%? And I think that's what brings me to this whole scenario of using vaginal douching and feminine hygiene products and trying to steam and clean and hoover and polish the vagina and remove the smell and remove the secretions. Why? I mean, I think this has been a serious misconception that has been perpetuated. And I would blame a lot of our medical community and the healthcare community for that. Because really, we are not trying to sterilize the vagina. We have to now start differentiating between two very distinct terms, one of which is disinfection. Sterilization is required in medical procedures when we are crossing the normal flora carrying orifices of our body and getting into the tissues behind or uterus or the ovaries, which is all sterile, or in your bloodstream or your lungs or whatever. But genital tract, nose, ears, even the conjunctival, the eyelids, the mouth, the upper respiratory tract up to your voice box, and same vagina and urethra are teeming with organisms. So, under no circumstances, as medical personnel, we would encourage anyone to sterilize these areas. Cleaning, yes, sterilizing, no. Okay, so that brings me to one of the next questions is how does the vagina protect itself and how does it normally clean itself in a woman who's not using any of these fancy products that, that are the talk of the kitty parties, that so to say. Now remember, the vagina is like a crumbled up structure, yeah? And we have these rugae inside. Then it is lined by the stratified squamous epithelium, under which we have these little mucus glands. The slight whitish discharge that people have normally comes and lines it nicely. So this forms like a protein barrier, like you would put Vaseline or a moisturizer on your skin. The vagina does it normally, it is supposed to. The mucosa, that's why the lining is called a mucosa, because it's lined by this thin proteinaceous material. Now, sticking to the vaginal epithelial cells are a big group of bacteria called the lactobacilli. Now, the lactobacilli, this forms the predominant, I mean, I told you we can actually list 100 different bacteria here, but I don't want to scare all of you by these fancy sounding names. So I'll just stick to simple names. So lactobacilli live, and it's a very big group. There are about 20 different species. So nowadays we call it the Lactobacillus acidophilus complex, which lives in the vagina. Why lactobacillus? Because they produce lactic acid. Lactic acid keeps the vaginal pH by between 2 to 3, but definitely less than 4. Yeah. Now the acid itself is like a weapon for any pathogen that may enter from below as part of normal intercourse, accidentally from the gastrointestinal tract. Your anus is right behind it, isn't it? So if you're not cleaning from front to back, or in small little girls, wearing pampers or whatever, or just, itching their backside, because children tend to do that. So they will then introduce these perianal flora, which is 1,000-fold more than the vaginal flora, it can accidentally get introduced into the vagina, especially in little girls, where they can and trouble. Now, nature has given us enough protective mechanisms to be able to make sure that nothing goes up into the cervix or the uterus or the sterile areas beyond. So what are these? So let's list them. So we have the acidic pH, because acid itself is antibacterial. We have these folds, so the vagina is nicely folded, so something that comes at the bottom will not naturally go up. Then remember, most of the times we are upright, sitting or standing. So even gravity helps to kind of bathe the vagina and throw the mucus outwards. That's why we've all seen that when we wear underwear, you'll have a little patch of mucus that will stain your underclothes. Yeah. So the acid, the anatomical structure itself, the mucus lining, the proteinaceous material, the help of the gravity, and the lactobacillus, which also produce hydrogen peroxide. Now, peroxide is a very powerful mechanism to cut up anything that comes in. So really, it's like a scissor that will come and cut up any pathogen, a disease-causing bacteria that may want to enter or cause trouble. So what are we doing? By douching or washing off the vagina or even the front area, is that we are washing away the protective mechanisms that nature has provided us to keep the vagina healthy and safe. And I always tell my students that, these normal flora or my microbiome is standing there like a line of soldiers guarding the entrance to my bodies. So whether it is my nose or my ears or my eyes, just the conjunctiva, or even my respiratory tract and the openings to my urethra from where I pass urine, and the opening to my vagina. Because remember, for procreation, you also need a man's penis to enter. Now, and Dr. Meenakshi had very jovially reminded me that some people say, oh, but do we boil the man's penis because before we indulge in an intercourse? No, because nature has provided us enough protective mechanisms by itself to make sure that as a normal human being, I can take care of the normal reproductive act that is required to make me a complete woman, like a mother. So where does the question arise of trying to sterilize this area, which as it is has its own armamentarium of protective mechanisms? Yeah. Does that make sense? Anybody wants to come in here? I'm not used to talking all by myself. I'm quite happy to take questions as I go along. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. It's making a lot of sense. We're really enjoying the talk.
Okay, all right. So, at least I should know that I'm talking in a language that's kind of getting through to the participants here. So please feel free to interrupt me at any time and go forward. Okay, so that's what. So let's take a break here from the normal vaginal architecture, the normal protective mechanisms, and the role of trying to use these feminine over-the-counter hygiene projects. I can see some here.
It's echoing.
There's an echo. Okay. So what is the next thing so then why do we have disease? Because remember, you speak to any woman of reproductive age group, and there is a whole, I'm sure the gynecologists know it more, but even in my practice with women and children dealing with their infections, vaginal discharges is every gynae patient who walks into a gynecologist clinic will talk about that. So then why do we have disease and what causes vaginal discharge? Now, when we talk of vaginal discharge, we talk of three organisms really. And I think it's very important to understand what is going on here. The top one is Candida, and Candida we know causes a white curdy discharge that women have, and most of the times it is because of an imbalance between the family of the bacteria and especially the fungi that normally live, the yeast especially, that normally live in the vagina. So remember, Candida is not something that comes from outside. What happens is that, an antibiotic, I mean, this is my favorite topic as a microbiologist, that people misuse antibiotics to such a great extent. And now even the antibacterial products, which are part of these, it's not right to take a name, but all these antiseptic soaps and whatever we use, basically what they are doing is disturbing the balance of all these different chapters of microbiology, as I call them, different classes of bacteria. They live in a harmony where even the numbers, the numerical proportions are very important to keep the protective mechanisms working in the right balance. Now, anything that disturbs that balance, a person having a different infection and taking a dose of antibiotic, or people whose immunity is suppressed, or they've had multiple sexual partners with dubious hygiene, whatever disturbs the balance of these bacteria, then the bacteria are suppressed and the yeasts that are normally present in the vagina start overgrowing. So then what happens? Then when we culture, we see these candida growing in too many numbers. So we say the woman has moniliasis or vaginal candidiasis, and we give them an antifungal pessary to treat that. So that is one important cause. And we know so it smells like, very vinegary smell, and we have a very characteristic yeasty smell, and all of us who bake, we know that smell. So that's one very important cause of vaginal candidiasis and discharge. The second one is a parasite, which is called Trichomonas vaginalis, and that is sexually transmitted. So that may have come with your contaminated fingers, or it may have come from your sexual partner. That's not normal. We have a cousin called Trichomonas tenax that lives normally here, but vaginalis is a pathogen. That one person that I said, in the list of that one person that I said are pathogens, can be introduced into the vagina through contaminated toilet seats, through shared towels, or through sexual intercourse. So it's one of the sexually transmitted infections that can cause a vaginal discharge, which is green and frothy. And then we just take a drop of that discharge, we put it on a slide, put a cover slip, and we can see this parasite swimming away. And I mean, I wish I could show you videos of this, but it's such a beautiful parasite. It kind of swims and glides and looks like those fancy kites that we have, the big kites with multiple flagella and very fancy Chinese kites. So I wish I could take all of you into my labs and show you these. My students love it. Anyway, so that was the number 2. So again, the characteristic of the discharge is so prominent that you will be able to pick it up even without going into the microscopy of it. The third one, and I think that has become the biggest bane of modern gynecology, my modern gynecologists dealing with vaginal discharges, is called bacterial vaginosis. Now, I'm calling it vaginosis and not vaginitis because medically these two terms are very different. Candida is a vaginitis. It causes inflammation, so your vagina will be red. When you have sex, it is painful. You will be itchy. And of course, there'll be lots of curdy, frothy discharge on your underclothes. Same thing happens with the parasite. So we have a fungus, we have a parasite. Now, the third is the most complex of all. And it is not a vaginitis because it doesn't cause inflammation. When you understand inflammation, there'll be redness, pain, itching. Here, it is the delicate balance of different types of bacteria. And for simplicity, I will say aerobic and anaerobic, which maintains the normal balance of the microbiome of the vagina. Now, what happens in bacterial vaginosis is that the anaerobes take an upper hand. Yeah. And all your products that we use, these antiseptic soaps and douches and sprays and deodorants. Remember, deodorants also have alcohol, which also kills bacteria. They all kill the aerobes, the poor miskeen, the easy ones to kill. So what happens? The anaerobes then take an upper hand, and we actually count in the labs. The anaerobes take an upper hand, and then comes the leader of the pack called Gardnerella vaginalis, and its cousins like Mobiluncus curtsii and Mycoplasma hominis and Bacteroides and Porphyromonas And there's a huge long list of anaerobic microbes. Anaerobic means that in the lab, they don't need oxygen to grow. So they then multiply, and then comes that bad smell, because people are very particular about the vaginal hygiene, and that smell bothers them. So what happens is that you'll have a thin gray watery discharge, and you have pain while you're having intercourse. And then, of course, the smell kills you, because these anaerobes, when they metabolize the glycogen that is present in your vagina, which the good lactobacillus are supposed to use to make the acid. Remember, when we add yeast or anything, khamir to our yeast to our bread, we always add sugar, because the bacteria and the yeast need that fermentation to produce acid to give us that nice taste to our yogurt or bread or whatever. So the same mechanism is normally present. But here you have killed the good bacteria, you've allowed to grow, and they're going to love that oxygen, the sugars, and give you these really foul smelling discharge. So one of the first things the women will come and complain to a gynecologist is that, I have a very bad smell after I have sex, because remember, the semen is also alkaline, and that also neutralizes the acidity. So at that point, it becomes really bad. So how do we diagnose it in the lab? One of the first things we do is just check the pH of the vagina. And I told you in the beginning, the vaginal pH is below 4. The minute we check the pH with the pH paper, I'm sure you all played with it in the chemistry labs in your school days, you just check the pH. If it's more than 4.5, that itself clinches the diagnosis of bacterial vaginosis. And then of course, we can take a drop of the vaginal discharge, put 10% KOH, and what we say whiff test, we can smell that horrible volatile amines that these bacteria produce. So we really don't even need to culture them. Just by their metabolic activities, we know it is bacterial vaginosis. And really, these three, the candida, the parasite, so one yeast, one parasite, and millions of bacteria together are the three most important causes of vaginal discharge in normal women. Okay. Now, this is very important for most people to understand. Apart from that, we are only talking of some very big diseases like gonorrhea and other sexually transmitted diseases like chlamydia and all, which present in a very different way, which have other characteristics like herpes. So I'm not going to go into the details of sexually transmitted infections, because that itself is a talk going over, I think, maybe a whole week. So we will not talk about the big STDs, just the common causes of vaginal discharge. Okay, what should I move on to next? Any questions here? Come on, ladies.
Hi, Dr. Nishi. Hi, Dr. Nishi. There are some questions. I'll just tell it. You may answer it one by one. Is vaginal discharge never transparent?
Sorry, say that again.
Is vaginal discharge never transparent?
See, the thin, whitish, transparent mucoid secretions that we have are usually the normal vaginal lubrication that nature has provided us. But like I told you, in bacterial vaginosis, you will have a thin gray homogeneous discharge. Homogeneous means more like translucent, like the egg white before it's cooked. Does that answer your question?
Shilpa, does that answer your question?
Hi, Smita. Thank you, ma'am. I think it's done. But is this natural lubrication throughout the month in women or only in
So, I didn't want to go into the details. What I said was applies to all women across the spectrum of their childbearing ages. Remember, the prepubertal discharge is different from the ones that you get after puberty, from the ones that you have post-menopause. And I'm not going into the details of all these phases of a woman's life, but remember, vaginal discharge and the vaginal flora, and I can go into the details if you want, is very different in prepubertal young girls to the time when you attain puberty to the postmenopausal women. Because each of these three phases of a human life, human female life, For instance, in a postmenopausal woman, because the estrogen is gone, I mean, that was the nature's way, but I'm not sermonizing here, but that was the way it is. So what is required at that point is not that heavy load of bacteria that is present in the normal childbearing, menstruating woman's vagina. Because then the need is not there to keep it acidic or to keep it so well protected. So it's like,
Sorry, Dr. Nishi.
you know, the deputation of the army is different from. Hello?
Dr. Nishi, your video froze a
Yes.
little. You might have to repeat the last sentence.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that it's like, you know, army. It's different from the war times to the peace times. In the war times, you have your full army of 1,000 trillion bacteria standing in attendance for any incursion into the vagina, like the army time, isn't it? Because remember, the penis and even during masturbation in a normal woman, you are putting your fingers. You don't sterilize your fingers in, do you? I mean, most people don't. You just maybe wash your hands with soap and water. However, in a postmenopausal woman, you're not that frequently indulging in sexual intercourse. So therefore, the number of bacteria and the type of bacteria changes. So from a predominantly lactobacillus complex bacteria, we have Staph and Strap and the Corynebacteriums, quite like the flora that you have in your normal skin.
Thank you,
So
Dr.
yeah.
There's one more question. Why does burning happen at times in the vagina during the menstrual cycle?
See, burning is not part of any normal. The burning is due to some imbalance in the organisms. That is why it is one of the important signs of vaginal discharge. So if a woman is complaining of intense burning, it may be due to urethritis. So remember, your urethra is very close to the vaginal opening. It's so you have your urethra, then you have your vagina, then you have the. So if there is any transference of organisms from the anal opening into the urethra, many a times it's due to the urethritis that you have burning, not due to vaginitis. And you know, incipient urethritis and urinary tract infections are a big problem in women, and many of them get missed as part of normal checkup that we do for women, unless we do a urine examination and culture. And I've seen that in my practice. Many a times women will complain of intense burning. However, if you check the vagina and the vaginal discharge, we don't find any pathogens. You just check the urine. So as a matter of practice, I had made sure in my hospital practice that all women complaining of vaginal discharge always do a urine analysis as well. Because, you know, women, I mean, an average non-medical woman does not understand the difference of this one half a centimeter difference between the urethra. For them, it's the, you know, the whole perianal area or perineal region.
Thank you, Dr. Nishi. There's one more question. Could you please be a little specific on our vaginal washing routine? Just washing with plain water is enough, or do we need a 3.5 pH vaginal wash, or what is the washing routine for cleaning the vagina?
So let's get this very clear. We never have to wash the vagina. The vagina is inside and curled up and sitting literally like this. And thank you, Meenakshi, for this model, because that really gives me, this is how the vagina is sitting in your pelvic bones. And if you all want to feel your pubic bone right as we talk, it is so low. So your pubic bone is here. So if you imagine my finger as the pubic bone, so when you touch, this is your abdomen, this is your pubic bone, all this is sitting behind, sitting like this. So under no circumstances, a normal woman has to put her finger in, put her 2-3 fingers in and go wash the vagina. No, absolute big no. All you have to do as part of your normal personal hygiene is when you take a shower, what you're washing is your vulva. And I think we need to be very clear about this. I'm actually willing to go on any advertising platform and stop this term of vaginal washes and vaginal douches and vaginal hygiene. The vagina is good enough and equipped enough to wash and take care of its own integrity and health. We never encourage anyone to put their fingers in to wash any pH, nothing is required. All you need to do is, as part of your normal daily personal hygiene routine in India or in warm countries where we live, you have a shower at least once a day. So you just wash the rest of your body in the front, you just wash the rest of your perineal area. Don't try and go in ever. And just normal soap and water that you use to wash your normal skin will suffice for the rest of the perineal region as well. Because, and I will reiterate this, we cannot live without our microbiome, neither here, nor in the rectum, nor in the lower 1/3 of urethra. Remember, in women, the urethra is only 4 centimeters long. Now, 4 centimeters compared to the 10 inches or whatever of your sexual partner is very little. So any attempt to now then disturb this lower 1/3 of the urethra is going to make the bacteria from the perineal region move into the urethra and cause urinary tract infections. And that is a bigger problem in women than recognized by most women.
Thank
I
you.
mean, I can quote you statistics of my 35-year practice that most vaginal discharges are, and this burning and dyspareunia that you face, the pain during sexual intercourse or burning or irritation is more to urethritis than vaginitis.
Thank you, Dr. Nishi. Much needed clarification. There's one more which says that why is there itching before the cycle?
Itching before the cycle, I think it's more to do with, see, remember, before the cycle, your hormones are at their peak. So estrogen and progesterone. So it is more hormonal related than actually related to any microbial cause there. And I think women, and I've seen that in practice, it's more to do with premenstrual tension and attention to that area because you're expecting your periods. Intercourse at that point is not very enjoyable. And I've seen that because remember, that's nature's way of, if you've become pregnant in that cycle, then your embryo is ready to implant at that point about a week or 5 to 7 days after you've had your intercourse and the fertilization has occurred. The embryo is now trickled down to the uterus. So this is nature's way of making sure that the woman doesn't feel very sexually motivated at that point. So what happens is that as a result of sexual arousal, you don't have much lubrication. And if you're having sexual intercourse at that point, it is a little uncomfortable. So it is more a mechanical cause than anything to do with infection. And if you then worsen it by using more of your vaginal douches and applying any whatever, all that is needed at that point. If you're not, we're not all looking to get pregnant in every cycle. And this is something that happens to women all the time. So what I would suggest is it is a lack of sexual arousal at that point. So we just advise women to use a water-based lubricant at that point, because it's more to do with friction than to do with anything to do with the vaginal hygiene at that point.
Okay.
So it's more hormonal and physiological than infectious.
Okay. There's also a question on, is the sexual arousal fluid very good for vaginal health? Is there any research between the both?
See, the vaginal arousal fluid or your increased vaginal mucosal secretion from the Bartholin glands, which are at the side of your vaginal opening in the vulva, all that just helps to make the sexual intercourse a more pleasurable and less painful process. I don't think, to my knowledge, I don't think there's any relation to vaginal health with the arousal fluid. However, the lack of arousal will irritate the vaginal wall. It's like you keep rubbing your skin, it will hurt, isn't it, after a while? If you keep itching, you will scrape off the surface layers. And I just finished telling you that the lining of the vaginal epithelium is stratified squamous, like your skin. The only difference is that the skin is keratinized to give a more protective, waterproof coating. We don't need a waterproof coating for the vagina. And also this business of how will I clean inside? Look, you don't need to clean inside because nature itself has provided a lining where it is required to be cleaned. For example, on the skin, the lining cells are keratinized, a thick protein that makes our hair and our nails to make sure that it's waterproof. In our respiratory tract, our nose, our mouth, and our larynx and the upper airways, we have the ciliated epithelium. Ciliated means that every cell has a little hair. That's why we cough, because remember, this is anti-gravity for us. Yeah. So anti-gravity, you cough, you choke, you vomit, so that we throw out. That's nature's protective reflex. We don't need that in the vagina. We have gravity to help us to wash the mucus as we go down. Yeah.
Thank you, doctor. So there's one common question that we come across when we talk to women about switching to menstrual cups. One of the common hesitations that women have is that some people say that they have a history of urinary infections, urinary tract infections. So they are hesitant to try the menstrual cup. Is there any relation, and how do we get them to try the how do we convince them to try it?
Like I said, because the urethra is so close by, people have like I said, you're actually repeating what I just said, that urinary tract infection is a big problem. But if you have learned the technique of insertion of your menstrual cup properly, then it's not going to interfere with the urethra. And I think most women, and I think it's a very cultural thing, I see amongst our Indian and Arab women that I work with here, that we have been taught to be ashamed of our perineal region, isn't it? If little girls masturbate, the mother goes and hits them on the knuckle and say, don't do that, it's dirty. Because we are taught to be ashamed of our perineal region. So therefore the myths around this region perpetuated by the mothers and the grandmothers. But as part of your training process, if you tell the women about the different orifices and how there are 3 different tracts, because I've seen it in my practice that women don't even understand the difference between the urinary passage and the vaginal passage. They tend to confuse the two. I'm sure you guys have also seen that. So when I talk to the ladies groups here, even women of my age group have, okay, now people are a lot more educated, but I also deal with the labor camps and, the women and the blue collar workers. The myths abound like there's no tomorrow. So if you teach the technique properly and say this is not going into the urethra, you have washed your hands with soap and water, you have washed your surface perineal region with soap and water, then you're, okay, I'm going to use Meenakshi's cup here. The cup properly into the vagina, where is the relation between the urethra and the vagina?
Dr. Nishi, can you tell
that
us
is
about...
certainly not a contraindication for using the menstrual cup. Yeah. Yes, sir, Meenakshi.
Can you tell us what is the difference between a tampon, a pad, and the menstrual cup? And why do you get toxic shock syndrome with the tampon wherein you don't get it with the menstrual cup?
Okay, so let's come to that. Now, what you're doing in a tampon, and I'm going to use the tampon here, you're taking the tampon and you're inserting it into the vagina, yeah? And of course, the tampons are made up of these super absorbent materials, which are mainly cellulase based, yeah? A lot of them are providing a substrate for the bacteria. And I just finished telling you that the whole vaginal wall is teeming with trillions of bacteria from every conceivable family known to microbiologists. Then the blood comes from the top and it's now getting collected in the tampon. Yeah. So what happens then? It is like putting a culture plate inside the vagina. You've actually put, like we use a culture plate in our labs to grow bacteria, and to grow the pathogens, the really bad ones, we use blood agar. Yeah, because blood is the best known medium for us to grow bacteria in our labs, because it provides the lovely hemoglobin, the protein, the minerals, the vitamins, you name it, and they have it. Yeah, and of course, glucose. Blood is full of glucose. Toxic shock syndrome.
Sorry, Dr. Nishi, we are
Was free
your screen
and modern. Yeah. So what you have done is that you have provided a wonderful substrate for the bacteria to now, normally you would change your tampon every day and you will throw it out. I had in 70s. This hospital, nobody had ever seen anything like this before. And she was in shock. Her blood pressure was low. She was unconscious. She had neurological problems. She had high grade fever. She had rash. And then, a 19-year-old woman, one of the first things, and especially in the sexually active Western population, first thing you think of is a illegal abortion, a termination, a miscarriage or something. So a smart doctor, ER doctor, put his fingers inside the vagina. She was not menstruating. She had forgotten to take out the last tampon because, towards the end of her period, the trickle is very low. And then this was cultured. And what was found was these really pathogenic varieties of staphylococcus in your skin, and some people carry it in their throat. Well, but because they got this very unusual.
Ma'am, your connection is very unstable.
Laden with lovely protein, mucus, discovered at that point, and the staphylococcal enterotoxin B, which I'm sure you've all encountered in your day-to-day life. Sometimes you eat some pani puri or something from outside and you come home and you feel nauseous and you throw up, because already the pani puri sitting outside with the nice hands of our chaatwalas are contaminated with staph, and you're giving them a nice medium to grow. They produce toxins. You consume it, and your body knows that this is toxic, so you throw out, you vomit it, or you have diarrhea, and you. So it is the toxic shock syndrome toxin 1 that was discovered for the first time in the tampon, and the staphylococcal enterotoxin B, which unfortunately was previously known for causing gastroenteritis or vomiting and diarrhea due to staphylococcal food poisoning. Now but toxic shock syndrome was not only known for tampons. It can be only 50% of the cases in the world are in menstruating women using tampons. It is the same organisms that live on your skin, your throat. So it can be with, these buds that we use for years can cause similar syndrome. The same buds that are used to clean for the nose or throat or whatever. So, and of course, infection, when you inserted these organisms by accident in wound infections or surgical site, or in patients who have cancers and all. So I'm not talking about that. This particular toxin is so serious that it can cause death within few hours if the woman is not given treatment immediately. And if you look at this toxin, I've seen patients of toxic shock syndrome where the skin just peels off. So it is actually called the staphylococcal scalded skin syndrome. Like when you pour hot water and your skin peels off, because because these bacteria are not just producing these two toxins, they're producing a whole army of toxins to cause disease. And one of them is an epidermolytic toxin, which really kills your epidermis and it peels off like layers, as if your hands have been burnt. So this the first case that was reported had all the classic symptoms, and subsequently it's about 1 in 100,000 users of tampon who end up with toxic shock syndrome. Because you put this super absorbent thing in your vagina and you forget about it.
Dr. Nishi, how much time do we have? Because there are a lot of questions coming. Can we take?
I'm happy to answer. I can go on. I have no issues.
Okay. So one is regarding pubic hair. Does it need to be cut, trimmed, or left as it is? What are the implications?
Okay. So first of all, let's go back to the physiology, because I think that's what is important to understand. Now, why did God provide us, or nature? I mean, I'm sure there will be some atheists who may object to the use of the word, but why did nature provide pubic hair in the first place? Remember, in any normal woman, pubic hair is the thickest hair we have in our body, isn't it? We would love to have that patch on our head rather than have it at the wrong end of the body. So remember, it provides us, so if this is my vulva, then this is my patch of pubic hair. It is, and if you've seen, it has actually a nice way of growing as well. So it is there to prevent friction as part of sexual intercourse. Because when you have intercourse, you're rubbing against the vulva, and then you're damaging the soft stratified squamous epithelium, which is lining your urethra and the vagina and the anus. So basically, it's a protective mechanism. Now, whether you keep it the way it is or whether you want to remove it for cosmetic reasons is entirely a personal choice. It has got nothing to do with feminine hygiene or implications for vaginitis or vaginosis.
Okay. So one more.
Absolutely only cosmetic. Having or not having has no implication. Not having is, of course, you're exposing your skin. But again, I will not stand on judgment here. It's entirely a woman's choice.
But not related to infections.
Absolutely not. However, having said that, women who are diabetic, because their tissues are laden with glycogen, they're not metabolizing their glucose effectively. So what happens is that with the hair, at the bottom of every hair follicle that comes out of your skin is a sebaceous gland. So sebaceous gland is again like a protein secretion. So, you know, the normal bacteria that live in the skin can get into the sebaceous gland, and you've seen those little boils that we get, folliculitis. So if you remove the hair, then the chances of folliculitis and cellulitis decreases. But that's entirely only for diabetic women or pre-diabetic women. But really, if you just wash and dry like you do the rest of your hair and your rest of your skin, then the chances of infection are not there at all.
Okay. One more question is on women who practice water sports like swimming and other things. If the water is unclean or it has chlorine or anything, then is there any implication to the vaginal health?
Look, that's why to keep in mind the structure of the vagina and the reproductive tract is very important. Now tell me, your vagina is sitting like this and you're going swimming or surfing or doing any water sports or swimming. How is the water going to get into this closed opening? Please enlighten me. And I think this message needs to go across very strongly, that the vagina is not sitting like an open cylindrical canal, sucking water actively like a suction pump. It's not. It's a closed thing. Unless you put fingers or have sexual intercourse, vagina in a normal woman is a closed organ. So there are no chances of getting in. However, if you interfere and you're washing and then trying to clean inside, then you're introducing things from outside. So whether it is chlorine or any chemicals or whatever, that's the problem. But as part of normal activities, nothing gets into the vagina.
So I don't understand this question. I'm going to read it out as it is.
Yes, please.
How does Mycobacterium tuberculosis enter the genital area, causing genital TB Why is what is the body's defense mechanism? Why is the body's defense mechanism not able to kill the TB bacteria?
Okay, let's go. This calls for a big lecture on Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And if you allow me the time, I will start from the very beginning. Mycobacterium tuberculosis, first of all, does not get in from the genital tract. Certainly never from the vagina. I've never seen a single case of genital tuberculosis coming from a man's penis having genital tuberculosis entering into the vagina. Having said that, I think for the person who's asked this question, I can understand the genuine concern. Mycobacterium tuberculosis, at least in the Asian population, we all get the infection as children. Yeah, that is why if you've seen at birth, we give BCG vaccine the day the baby is born, because we want to give a related mycobacterium exposure to stimulate the immune system by related mycobacterial antigens to be able to fight disease, not infection. And I think this concept needs to go out very strongly, that we are not here to prevent mycobacterial infection. The purpose of giving mycobacterial BCG vaccine or the TB vaccine is to prevent disease. We are actually giving infection so that we prevent disease in the patients. Okay, so that is at childbirth, when you're born at birth. However, as you grow older, if you've been exposed to a patient of tuberculosis, and amongst your seniors or contacts in the family or your grandparents or other people, in your immediate environment, and especially for healthcare workers, it's a big risk from the patients. So you may then get the infection, not primary infection, disease, and you will then have disease. Always the primary infection is pulmonary, always in your lungs or lymph nodes of the respiratory tract. It is a respiratory infection. Okay, what happens is then the bacteria can go quiet in your lungs, and what is called the primary focus. You have a little infection of your surrounding lymph nodes, and then it goes quiet. When your immunity is suppressed or there are other stress related issues, these bacteria that are sitting in your lower lobes of the lung, then they start multiplying, get into your bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream travel to the genital region. So it is not through the vagina, it is coming from the blood supply of the uterus, and then cause genital tuberculosis of the tubes or of the endometrial lining. So the tubes, because they're so thin, I mean, the opening of the tube is like the tip of my pencil. It's really 1 millimeter. So and of course, in tuberculosis, the bacteria are so nasty, they generate a very strong immune response and then heal by fibrosis. So it is not the bacteria that is blocking the tube, it is the fibrosis that blocks the tube, and hence women become infertile. They are not able to conceive naturally. The other thing that happens is that the endometrial lining is fibrosed. So you're not making this rich, juicy endometrium for the embryo to implant. So these women can face problems of infertility. And of course, if the tuberculosis disease continues, then the ovaries get involved and the whole area gets all fibrosed and packed up in additions, and it's a very serious disorder. But please, I will reiterate, Mycobacterium does not come in from the vagina. It is a blood-borne infection with the primary focus in the lung. And as far as the immunity, and I think that was also a part of the question, the immunity to Mycobacterium tuberculosis is not by antibodies, it is a cell-mediated immunity. What does that mean? That means that these mycobacteria are such clever pathogens that they actually get into my first line of defense cells, which are called macrophages. These are the ones that go around patrolling the rest of my body and picking up any pathogen that is got into my tissues. Remember, lungs are sterile. So once the mycobacterium has got into my lungs, these alveolar macrophages, which are the alveoli, the macrophages in my lung spaces, air spaces, They pick up the mycobacteria, but it is such a nasty pathogen that it gets into the macrophages and is not killed. In fact, it grows happily inside the macrophages. So then what do? If you can't kill, your BSF and CRPF cannot kill, or the Delhi police cannot kill the criminals or terrorists, then who do you call? You call the army, isn't it? So what do? Then you call the army of your cytotoxic T cells, which are the real killers. And you say cytotoxic means it will kill the cell. So not only does it kill them, because it can't kill the macrophage, it is sitting inside my cell. So these cytotoxic cells come and kill the cell itself. And that is what we are priming by giving children, by giving BCG. We are priming the cytotoxic T cell immunity to kill the disease, not the infection. Does that answer, or you need more immunological
Thank you for the
details?
detailed answer. We have time for one more question. Dr. Meenakshi wants you to answer this. Why do pads stink?
Shall I answer that? Or Minnie, you want to do it?
No, you do it.
Minnie is
Okay.
asking it.
Why do pads stink? Okay. So I think it's related to the microbial flora, isn't it? Because you're using a pad and you're putting it on top of the vagina, yeah? So when you're excreting your menstrual fluid, that's through the vagina, picking up all these hundreds and millions of bacteria, then you're again providing a culture medium which is collecting blood, yeah? And then this is again like a culture plate in the lab. So if you don't change your pads frequently, you're allowing a good substrate. So it is a culture plate sitting on my, so it is because of the alteration of the blood by the bacteria. Remember the lactobacillus are normal acid producing bacteria, and blood is full of glucose. Yep. So the glucose will be acted upon by the bacteria, and then you will smell, because as part of the bacterial metabolism, they produce these volatile amines that are smelly. So we always tell women that once your pad is full, then please go change it. We teach our girls to do that, isn't it?
So if the menstrual cup is holding the blood, then would that blood in the menstrual cup get infection?
See, again, infection and disease has to be different. Remember, the menstrual cup is forming a plastic barrier in the vaginal wall. So I mean, from what I understood from you is that when you're teaching women to wear the menstrual cup, it is around the opening of the cervix. So the cervix is sterile. Remember, the external os and the internal os are two very narrow cervical canal passages which only allow the blood to trickle out. There is no reverse passage here. And then you're forming a mechanical barrier with the vaginal mucosa. Remember, the bacteria are not swimming around in the vagina. They're all lined up. Bacteria do not grow in solutions. They like to adhere to substrates. That is what the problem happened with the tampon. You gave them an adherent surface, because bacteria by nature need a surface to adhere before they start multiplying. So yes, there will be some dead bacteria in the menstrual cup. When it's full, you're going to wash it off. But you're not giving them enough time for live bacteria to climb in from the vaginal wall, go into this surface. And remember, silicone grade plastic is a medically approved material that we use for our catheters and tubes and various other paraphernalia that we use in our medical practice, because the structure of the resin is such that it does not allow bacteria to adhere with their cilia and their fimbriae. Remember, bacterial attachment is a very, very important what should I say, subject amongst infectious disease physician, because unless the bacteria find a place to adhere to, they will not start growing and multiplying. And if they don't grow and multiply, we are not worried about them causing any issues. Yeah, so you're protecting yourself by two ways. One is by this physical barrier, then you're providing a material that does not support the growth of bacteria. Theoretically, blood cells themselves can provide an adherent surface, but then you're not giving them enough time. Once it is full, every day you throw it away.
Correct. Wonderful. Thank you for that lovely explanation, because it's a very common question that is always asked of us.
Yeah, no. So I think what you need to get across to your audience when you're advocating the use of the cup is that make sure that it is, once it is full, it is not left like the tampon. The tampon itself is a good thing, but then having left it and giving it long enough time for the bacteria to grow and adhere and multiply and then produce toxins take time. Even in the lab, we take 2 to 3 days for all this to be demonstrated for our diagnostic and teaching purposes and research. So bacterial addition and attachment is a very important thing. And I think I'll clarify that because there were some questions about the UTI as well. That we have E. coli by billions in our stool, but not every woman gets UTI, because there are women who are prone to UTI, carry certain types of E. coli which have more fimbriae. The fimbriae are these minor cilia-like hair on the bacterial cell. So therefore, they have this tendency to attach. Once they attach, they can multiply and grow up into the urinary tract. So this bacterial attachment and colonization is a very important sign of pathogens, the ones that cause disease.
So, in your opinion, how do you keep the menstrual cup clean? Do you have to boil it? Do you have to sterilize it?
I mean, see, again, like I said in the beginning, I think women must understand this concept of sterilization and cleanliness. When we are doing cleaning in public health measures, we are just making sure that there are no pathogens. So by definition, the WHO definition of disinfection is that we reduce the bacterial load to a level that is considered acceptable by public health standards. And I'll give an example of drinking water. When we say this water is safe for drinking, this is not sterile water. We are saying this water has the E. coli count below a certain level that is determined by the municipality of different cities and countries. Okay, so this water is safe for drinking because the E. coli count is below this level. But never, ever, anywhere we say that this is sterile water. Yeah.
So just washing the cup with
so
normal.
The same thing applies to menstrual hygiene. We are not looking for sterilization. Boiling means sterilization. Cleaning means plain soap and water or whatever your material allows. I will not even put alcohol on silicone because alcohol itself is a very corrosive material. So the minute you start corroding the straight surface, you're making microscopic holes and you're creating niches for bacteria to adhere firmly. You don't want to do that. You want to keep the integrity of this plain surface. And if you've seen in the kitchen and all, we prefer laminates. Why? Because we are providing a smooth surface. The minute it's crevices and broken areas, we provide niches for bacteria to grow. You don't want to do that. So my advice for any medical equipment that is used in non-sterile areas of the body is to just wash with soap and water and non-corrosive soap. And certainly not boiling.
So you don't want to put soap in because the soap is alkaline and it can change the acidic milieu of the vagina.
Exactly. So I think from your manufacturers, they will always, any product comes with its cleaning instructions. And if for this particular material, the cleaning instruction says plain water, that's good enough.
Okay, great. All right. Do we have any more questions concerning the use of the menstrual cup and the cloth pad uh, and hygiene. Don't ask for other questions, please, because that we'll answer some other time.
Yeah, ma'am, I just have one question. On the pads, sometimes when you menstruate, the blood could be coming or turning black in 1 or 2 hours of bleeding. So, can that be cause of infection, or is it that the
Okay,
blood
first,
itself is like that?
okay. So why does the blood turn black? Do you know that? Do you know the answer to that? Remember, I finished telling you that the vaginal pH is acidic. So once the acidic pH exposes the red blood cells, which are bright red blood cells with hemoglobin inside, once the acid acts on this blood, the blood cells break and release the hemoglobin, which then turns black in the acidic pH because of the breakdown and the oxidation that happens on exposure to air. So that's a normal process. I wouldn't worry about the blood turning black. And coming to the infection part, yes, once you release the hemoglobin from the cells, in the lab, we make what is called chocolate agar, because once we release the hemoglobin, that is a juicier material for the bacteria to grow. That we use for pathogens like Streptococcus pneumoniae, Haemophilus influenzae, Neisseria gonorrhoeae. But these are not normally present in a normal, healthy vagina. These are pathogens that we have in lab that can cause pneumonia, otitis media, middle ear infections. Gonococci causes gonorrhea, which is again a sexually transmitted disease. But in a normal woman, we do not expect any of these pathogens in the vagina. So even if it's turning black, I'm not worried. It's just going to be thrown away, isn't it, or washed?
So one of the questions was, is there any connection between HPV and cup use? Does the cup support viral infection? And does the cup lead to erosion? Erosion is a different cup of tea.
Okay, so no. I respect every question because that also gives us an opportunity to clarify a lot of concepts here. So let me start one by one. One is HPV. What is HPV? Human papilloma viruses. Viruses, by definition, need a living cell to multiply and grow. Okay, viruses are not organisms in the strictest sense of how we define living beings. That's why we even though we list viruses in group of organisms, we call them viral agents or viral particles, because virus, and especially HPV, is nothing but a piece of DNA, a very big piece of DNA, enclosed in a protein core. It can only live inside a living cell. That is why HPV is a sexually transmitted infection, which happens when a cell meets a cell. That means when the infected secretions from your husband's penis or, has moved into the vagina, and it does not cause vaginal infection. Let's get that very clear, because vaginal cells are lined by, vaginal mucosa is lined by stratified squamous epithelium, which is not a permissive cell for this virus to attach. Viruses are a different ball game completely. They are very specific in their surface proteins. And I think with corona, everybody I know has become a virologist. So everybody knows about the spike protein. Every virus has specific proteins which need specific receptors in the host cell to attach. The attachment receptors for HPV are either in the skin, that's why you have plantar warts on your skin and your soles of the feet, or in the perianal area, that's why you have genital warts, or in the cervical cells. So HPV does not cause vaginal infection. It only uses the vagina to enter the cervix. Okay, so you need living cells for viruses to grow. Now, how does your menstrual cup have living cells? Please enlighten me.
Correct. Okay. So I think whoever has asked about blood not stinking in the cup has to go back, re-look at what Dr. Nishi said, and hear it few times before you internalize it.
Yeah,
and for urinary incontinence, This is not a urinary incontinence lecture. That's
Yeah.
a completely different thing.
I was going to say
Please
that's a
leave
1 hour
that.
lecture by itself.
Yeah, we can talk about it at length, but this is mainly to talk about infection, vagina, pads, tampons, and menstrual cup and cloth pads. So I think we have
One
answered
last
all the
question on
questions.
that. Sorry, one
Smita?
last question on that. Regarding this only, if a person is prone to urinary infections, any special care to be taken when if the person is using cloth pads?
So I told you that people who are prone to recurrent UTIs have these very specific strains of E. coli, because remember the urinary tract infection does not come from the vaginal microbes. That you have to be very firm in telling people that UTI causes bacteria do not live in the vagina. They come from the rectal canal. They come from the anus. Okay, because all these strains of E. coli, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, Proteus, these are the top 4, 5, or Staph aureus. They are anal pathogens or rectal pathogens. They are not pathogenic when they're sitting in the rectum, but when they move into the urinary tract, they become pathogenic because these are the adherent strains of E. coli. So the precaution here is two things. One is to get the message across that this is not part of the vaginal bacteria or vaginal microbiome. This comes from the rectum. So the precaution is wash your hands with soap and water. Make sure your vulvar area is washed and clean and dry, because remember this bacteria love moisture. So whenever they have moisture, they have these biofilms, and then that makes it easier for them to move forward and attach. So movement and attachment are very important for bacterial or infectious disease pathogenesis. So once you remove, so wash, dry, the cup should be dry, and then you can use a water-based lubricant to insert it into the vagina. Do not interfere with the periurethral area, because periurethral area is very sensitive, and in women who have recurrent UTI, sometimes we even teach them how to put just betadine before and after intercourse, because most of the frictional injury happens during intercourse. So if you just put betadine before and after, or empty your bladder before and after sex, then they have less chances of UTI. But again, UTI is another 2-hour lecture that I can take. But in short, yes.
Yes, Smita, will you conclude?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Nishi. We've got so many answers, and we're very happy that we recorded the whole thing. I'll be sharing the recording with you, and with your permission, we'll be sharing with the rest of the participants as well. So these are a few questions that we've been getting whenever we've been taking sessions, and because of lack of information, lack of confidence, we've been just directing all those questions to Dr. Meenakshi. So she just kindly arranged for this session for all of us. So thank you so much for all your patience and beautiful explanations. And thank you, Meenakshi, for connecting us and for organizing this. And thank you, all of you. We had around 99 participants at one point of time.
100.
100 ho gaya? Achha.
You guys are keeping.
So that shows what a hot topic it is, and questions are continuing to pour in, but we're just going to have a hard stop here because some of them are repeating. I think few people missed the earlier part of the session. So hopefully when we share the video, most of the questions will be answered. Thank you so much for being crystal clear on this, and thank you so much for joining us.